Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. Green growth. It's a term you've no doubt heard before, but may not know much about. But that's about to change. On today's After 10, we are joined by Yvo de Boer, the new Director General of the Seoul-based Global Green Growth Institute. Mr. Director General, thank you very much for being on the program.
My pleasure.
And first of all, congratulations on your new position as Director General of GGGI. You come in, of course, with a wealth of experience, a wealth of knowledge as well. What is your top priority in this new post?
My top priority is probably to develop a better global understanding of what green growth, what a different model of economic growth means, especially for the developing countries and economies in transition who are the primary focus of this organization. My sense is that green growth, sustainable growth, creative economy are concepts that everybody talks about, but people are still struggling very much to understand what exactly it means in practice and how you actually can take economic growth in a different direction than some of the growth models we've seen in the past.
So let's take that step right here. Let's talk about green growth. This is a term that we're hearing a lot about these days. What is the definition? How would you define green growth?
I don't think I would have a single definition that everyone would be happy with. I think it's more a matter of what are we trying to achieve. And I think the situation that we're in is that we are faced as humanity with a number of pretty fundamental global challenges. The first and obvious one is climate change. Which is already impacting many countries around the world. Then secondly, issues around energy prices and energy security, which we see being top issues in Europe and China, but you know, basically around the world. Thirdly, food, I think, is going to be one of the major challenges facing humanity over the coming decades. Water is a big issue. In some places where you would like to have a little bit less water, they're getting an awful lot more, and in other places we're seeing very severe drought. And on top of that come issues around material price increases, material scarcity in some cases, the loss of ecosystems, deforestation, and all of that is driven by three things that are related to us. Still a massive global population growth, still a very strong increase of the global middle class. The global middle class is probably going to double in size between 2010 and 2030, according to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So more and more wealthy people, which is good news, but those people are spending differently, consuming more, their eating habits are changing. So that's creating pressure, and we're a rapidly urbanizing world. Half of us live in cities already at the moment. That's probably going to go to 70%. So you have a number of challenges around climate, energy, food, water, ecosystems, material scarcity on the one hand, and us as a global population that's growing richer, increasing the pressure. So the challenge that we face, whether you call it a sustainability challenge or a green growth challenge, is how can you basically lift humanity out of poverty, give people a decent lifestyle without creating more climate pressure, more energy pressure, more food pressure, etc. So how can you find that balance? How can you basically live within the carrying capacity of the planet?
And the focus then of GGGI is on these emerging, these developing countries. Tell us about what the goal is there and why they are the particular focus of the Institute.
I think that's important for two reasons. First of all, because the old model of economic growth, and by the old model of economic growth, I mean the model that made the West rich, that basically is the only example that we have at the moment. So there is a very strong perception in many developing countries, in China, in India, in many countries in Africa, that the only way to grow your economy and lift people out of poverty is to follow the example of the West. And if we all do that, we're going to be in deep trouble. The second reason is that if you build a power plant, it's going to be around probably for 30 to 50 years. The same applies to a steel factory or an auto factory. In other words, if we begin to lock in technology in the wrong way, we're going to be stuck with it for a long time, and it's going to be very expensive to change direction. So for that reason, it's really important to show countries a different model for economic growth up front, so that they make the right choices from the beginning, as opposed to having to change direction halfway, which is probably what Western Europe, Eastern Europe, North America will need to do.
So then in terms of what GGGI is doing on the ground to help these countries develop these green growth models, what specifically is the Institute doing in these countries to get them there?
What we basically do is work with those countries on a green growth journey. So generally our work starts off with a risk assessment, assessing to what extent countries are exposed to some of these global trends on climate, energy, food, water that I was talking about. Secondly, working with those countries to understand how they can take their economic growth in a different direction, to be less energy intensive, less resource intensive, less water intensive, but also to add more value to their economy, to grow the economy in a more creative way than perhaps convention shows, then translate that into sectoral strategies, so strategies around energy, around agriculture, around infrastructure, and then after all of that get to some real implementation as well.
Can you tell us a little bit about the examples of maybe a specific country who has you've worked with, who has seen these changes take effect already and are enjoying the fruits of the labor, so to speak?
Well, maybe to give you two examples at two extremes of the spectrum. The first is I'll actually be going to the United Arab Emirates next week, and what we're doing is working with the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, to develop a green growth strategy across the economy. They're very reliant on fossil fuels at the moment. They're very keen to diversify their economy. They also have major challenges around water, around infrastructure. So what we're doing there is working with the UAE government across the board to shape a green growth strategy that will take them away from such a strong reliance on fossil fuels. That's one end of the spectrum. At the other end of the spectrum, we're working in Rwanda, in Africa, with that government on how they can exploit, how they can utilize forest resources more effectively, how they can come to a better development of rural centers, to villages in different parts of the country. And there are many other examples in between. In Mexico, we're working on major urban infrastructure development. In Ethiopia, we're working to create a green finance institution. So the Global Green Growth Institute really works across the board.
You spoke earlier about climate change and the devastating effects it's likely to have on all of us in the coming years and decades. You talked about food production, finding new sources of energy, of course, is a big challenge as well, lack of water resources. How specifically can GGGI and is the Institute right now working to find a solution to those very big problems that we're facing?
Well, what we very consciously do not do is get involved in the international negotiations. I think we should leave that to the politicians. We're very much an institute that helps developing countries to focus on their priorities in terms of economic growth. But what we do in that context is reduce the fossil fuel dependency of countries by working on better energy strategies, by helping them to diversify their energy sector, for example, by putting more renewable sources of energy in place, by modernizing their agricultural sector, making their cities more efficient. So it's really all about understanding the priorities of those countries and working on implementation around those priorities.
And in terms of Korea, of course, Korea helped to establish GGGI. It has a definite interest in this field. In terms of becoming a model for green growth, where does Korea stand right now?
Well, in 2008, something very interesting happened in Korea. In 2008, the world was pretty much devastated by the beginning of the global economic crisis. And what struck me at that moment in time, that most countries looked for solutions to future issues in the past. And let me explain what I mean. What I saw was that a lot of countries, especially in Europe, started to take apart the innovation programs that they had, for example, for renewable energy. They tried to make conventional energy cheaper, basically going back to manufacturing as the solution for economic growth in the future. I saw Korea doing something fundamentally different. At the time of the economic crisis in 2008, Korea decided to devote about 2% of its GDP to greening economic growth, to taking economic growth in a different direction, in a much more innovative direction. So basically, what I saw Korea do was get ready for the future by looking in the future instead of in the past. And that experience has proved to be very successful in terms of making, I think, the Korean economy more creative, more resilient, more innovative. If you look at all of the Korean technology that at the moment is in power plants around the world, in the ICT sector, in the healthcare sector, in automobiles, then really Korea has been able to use innovation as an instrument to grow the economy. So in that sense, Korea really is an example that is, I think, interesting for the rest of the world. And of course, I'm happy that Korea has invested in this institute to spread that message.
There's always progress to be had, of course, though a lack of participation among Korean businesses has been mentioned quite often here as being a problem, perhaps a problem, especially moving forward. Why do we see hesitancy amongst business groups, not just here in Korea, but in general when it comes to this drive for green growth?
I think it's because at the moment, the cost of pollution, the cost of taking things out of the environment is not calculated into the cost of what you and I buy. For example, if you and I buy a chair or a table or a loaf of bread, then the environmental cost associated with making that product is not calculated into the price. In most countries, emitting greenhouse gas emissions is not priced. In many countries, water is not priced properly. We don't seem to respect the value of food in the sense that in developing countries, about half of all food produced is lost between the field and the supermarket because of badly managed supply chains. In industrialized countries, certainly the wealthier ones, we throw away about half of the food that we buy. So basically at the moment, we're not respecting the environment, we're not respecting natural resources, and we're not calculating the value of those things into price. The challenge for industry is that if you begin to calculate the cost of climate or energy or water into the price of a product, it pushes the price of a product up. If you make electricity more expensive in Korea to reflect the costs in terms of climate change, then Korean automobiles, Korean steel, Korean ships will become more expensive. And that only works if everybody works to make energy, for example, reflect better the cost to the environment. So I'm taking an awfully long time to say that basically what industry is looking for is a level playing field, is basically looking for a guarantee that their competitors around the world will be confronted with the same price increases, the same challenges. So I do not believe that business people are evil. I do not believe that business people are trying to destroy the environment. But what business people would like to see is a way forward that allows them to compete in a way that is fair with their competitors around the world.
So I guess the question is, how do we get to that point where it is a level playing field? I know it's not a simple question to answer, but what needs to be done? I mean, how do we get to that point with all the things that we're looking at now in the coming decades?
I think there are two aspects to the answer to that question. The first is I've spent the past 4 years of my life working exclusively with the private sector around the world. And I've basically seen progressive industries, progressive companies engage on sustainability or green growth or creative economy for 1, 2, or 3 reasons. The first reason is because they see sustainability as an opportunity for growth by putting new products and services into the market. And much of what Korea is doing in the ICT sector, the healthcare sector, around battery technology, fuel cell technology, is all about creating growth, new markets through new products and services. So I see companies focusing on sustainability for growth. Secondly, I see companies focusing on sustainability in order to reduce cost by using less energy, less water, producing less waste, managing their supply chain better. And thirdly, I see companies engaging on sustainability in order to safeguard their brand. If you pollute mining sites or treat your workers badly, that's not good for your share value. So for the private sector, it's all about growth, it's all about cost reduction, and it's all about safeguarding your brand. I think those same three reasons apply to countries. So in other words, the first half of the answer to the question that you may have already forgotten, but the first half of the answer is you can actually influence the level playing field by being innovative, by creating change yourself. The second, much more complicated way to achieve a level playing field is by negotiating internationally, by ensuring that other countries pull their weight, that other countries also price climate or energy properly in the same way that perhaps Korea or Europe or the US wants to do. And in fact, if I look at the international climate change negotiations, those seem to be less about what countries are offering to do themselves and more about what countries are asking others to do.
What I think I hear you saying in a way as well, you know, we've heard a lot here in Korea about the creative economy. There may be some questions about how it connects with this push for green growth, with sustainability. What is the connection there? I think you've sort of touched on it a little bit, but what is the direct connection there between the two?
Well, there's a much repeated joke that the Stone Age didn't end because the stones were finished, but that the Stone Age ended because we found something better. And I'm sure that there were mass demonstrations from the stone arrowhead makers when the bronze arrowhead makers came along, but the bronze arrowhead makers had an innovation. Sure. And in that sense, I think a lot of what Korea is seeking to do around the creative economy is all about building that kind of innovation, creating an economic growth model around people's brains, as opposed to around pulling a lot of things out of the ground. So the challenge is very much one of how can you create an economy that is not resource intensive, that is innovative, that respects global boundaries around climate, etc.
I mean, it seems like we're right on the cusp of major changes as well. I mean, how close are we to getting to where you would like to see us be?
I think we're a lot closer to where I would like to see us not be than close to where we should be. I think part of the problem with many of these global challenges around climate, energy, food, water is that they're slow moving. And that people have a tendency to think, well, that's such a complicated challenge, maybe I can worry about that one tomorrow or next week. So basically, I do not see the international community engaging at the moment on climate, but not on a number of other global challenges either. And that worries me. It worries me in the sense that I think we're getting close to a number of tipping points, that we're getting on a number of issues close to the point where there will be no turning back. And let me give a non-climate example. If you take all of the fish out of the ocean, there's no more fish in the ocean, and it gets sort of difficult to put them back in. So in that sense, issues around fisheries, just like issues around climate, need to be brought under control in time.
There is this definite sense of urgency, but we're not seeing necessarily the movement that you or other people would like to see. Why is that? What is it going to take to get to that point?
I think that depends a lot on political convergence, on political engagement. I mean, the last piece of the international climate change negotiations that I was involved in was the big climate change conference in Copenhagen in 2009, where we basically saw the international community fail to reach an agreement. And the reason why the international community failed to reach an agreement is because many countries did not see it as being in their economic interests to act on climate change. They recognized the environmental side of the problem, but didn't really yet fully understand how they could engage on it politically and economically. And I think there was especially a strong sense on the part of the United States that China was not doing enough, and a strong sense on the part of China that the United States was not doing enough. In that sense, I think we've seen big progress in the debate between the United States and China. I think that John Kerry is the relatively new Secretary of State in the US who understands the climate issue very well, who used to chair the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, who tried very hard to push climate and energy legislation through the Congress and the Senate in the US. John Kerry understands this issue very well. He's reaching out to China. China is reaching out to him. And that makes me more confident that we might see progress in Paris next year at the next big round.
How, I guess, optimistic are you that we will see concrete progress in December 2015 in Paris?
Well, my hope is if countries can keep it simple, that we can see progress. I mean, oddly, although climate is probably one of the most complex international issues that we're confronted with, the solutions that you need to find need to be simple, in the sense that if you have 197 countries at the table, that makes things very complicated. If you have countries with very differing interests at the table, you know, oil-producing countries that want to keep exporting oil, small island countries that are about to disappear, rich countries that would like to stay rich, poor countries that would like to get rich, you really need to find the essential common ground that really allows countries to unify around a solution. And for that reason, I think if countries can keep it simple in Paris next year, they might be able to reach an agreement.
And you've just started your term as the Director General of GGGI. Looking ahead to the next few years, what are your future goals for the organization?
My goals for the organization are to really work with developing countries to help them understand how green growth can be made to work for them and to spread that story around the world. My sense is that whether it's green growth or sustainable growth or other kinds of growth, these are concepts that everybody subscribes to intellectually, but very few countries have actually succeeded in making work in practice, at least across the economy. Some countries have been successful on energy, others on agriculture, but few countries across the board. So we really need to build that evidence base. We really need to demonstrate that, yes, you can grow your economy in a different direction and make people more prosperous. And building that evidence base is what I want to focus on.
We'll certainly look forward to GGGI taking the reins on all of these problems that we've talked about today, these issues that we've talked about, and making real progress, making real changes in the future. Mr. Director General, thank you very much for being on the program. We appreciate it.
Thank you. I've enjoyed it.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time, After 10.
We will continue to do our best to improve our show based on the perspective of our viewers. Always feel free to leave us any comments, great ideas, or suggestions you wish to share with us.